I sat in my wheelchair at the kitchen table, staring at the real estate appraisal in my hands. 22 years of military service, 2 tours in Afghanistan, a Purple Heart hanging on the wall, and now my own family was telling me I was too broken to live in my own home. The document showed my house was worth $850,000, more than enough to buy that luxury penthouse they'd been eyeing downtown. What they didn't know was that I'd already signed the papers that morning, and by the time they returned from their family intervention meeting, I'd be holding the keys to their dream home while they scrambled to explain to their friends why their disabled mother had outsmarted them all. The morning had started like any other Wednesday in October. The autumn light streamed through the kitchen windows of the 2-story colonial I'd called home for 15 years, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. I'd been up since 0500, as was my habit from decades of military discipline. The coffee was already brewing, black and strong, just the way I'd learned to drink it in the desert camps where cream and sugar were luxuries we couldn't afford. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and at 53, I've seen more of the world than most people see in 3 lifetimes. From the mountains of Colorado where I grew up, to the training grounds of Fort Benning, to the unforgiving terrain of Kandahar province, I've never been one to back down from a challenge. The roadside bomb that took my left leg below the knee 3 years ago was supposed to be my breaking point, according to the doctors. According to my family, it was proof that I needed to be managed, protected, contained. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same people who'd once bragged about having a war hero in the family were now treating me like a fragile China doll who might shatter at the first sign of stress. My daughter Sarah, 31 and armed with a psychology degree she wielded like a weapon, had appointed herself my primary caretaker. My son Michael, 28 and fresh out of business school, had decided that my financial affairs needed his expertise. Together, they'd formed an alliance that would have made any military strategist proud if it hadn't been aimed directly at dismantling my independence. The house had been my sanctuary when I returned from my final deployment. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a wraparound porch that caught the morning sun just right, and yes, a staircase that led to the 2nd floor where my master bedroom overlooked the neighborhood I'd grown to love. It was in Millbrook Heights, a quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon, where the neighbors knew each other's names and the mail carrier stopped to chat about the weather. I'd paid cash for it with my savings and veteran benefits, every dollar earned, through sacrifice and service. But according to Sarah and Michael, the stairs were a death trap waiting to claim their helpless mother. Never mind that I'd been navigating them just fine with my prosthetic leg and the handrail I'd installed. Never mind that I'd completed 2 half marathons since my amputation, or that I volunteered 3 days a week at the VA hospital, helping other veterans adjust to their new realities. Never mind that I'd spent months in physical therapy, not just to walk again, but to run, climb, and live on my own terms. The first hint of their plan had come 6 months ago, during what Sarah had called a casual family dinner. Casual, like the way generals casually discussed troop movements over morning coffee. Michael had brought his laptop, filled with spreadsheets and charts that supposedly demonstrated the financial burden of maintaining a 2-story house. Sarah had brought pamphlets for assisted living facilities, each one glossier than the last, promising worry-free living for active seniors. Active seniors. As if 53 was ancient. As if a missing leg made me ancient. As if the woman who'd once diffused explosive devices in a war zone couldn't figure out how to navigate her own staircase. "Mom, we're just thinking about your safety," Sarah had said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd learned to recognize and despise. "What if you fall? What if there's an emergency and you can't get downstairs quickly? We worry about you every single day." Michael had nodded along, his fingers dancing across his laptop keyboard as he pulled up real estate listings. "And think about the equity you're sitting on, Mom. This house is worth a fortune now. You could sell it, buy a nice ground floor condo, and have hundreds of thousands left over for your retirement." It just makes sense. What made sense to me was that they'd clearly done their homework. The Portland real estate market had exploded in the past few years, and my little house in Millbrook Heights was suddenly worth nearly $1 million. $1 million that they seemed to think would be better served funding their own dreams than providing me with the independence I'd fought so hard to maintain. Sarah had recently married David, a software engineer with expensive tastes and a tendency to make grand pronouncements about optimizing life choices. They'd been renting a cramped apartment downtown, paying $3,000 a month for 800 square feet and a view of a brick wall. Michael was living with his girlfriend Jennifer in her parents' basement, a situation that clearly chafed at his business school-educated pride. But what they both really wanted, what they'd been talking about for months, was the penthouse at Harborview Towers. 42nd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, panoramic views of the city skyline and Mount Hood. 3 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a gourmet kitchen with marble countertops, and a price tag of $800,000. Just within reach. If only their stubborn mother would see reason and liquidate her impractical asset. They'd shown me the listing at least a dozen times, their eyes bright with possibility. "Can you imagine the view, Mom?" Sarah would say, pulling up photos on her phone. "And it's got 24-hour security, concierge service, a gym on the 20th floor. You'd love it there." Michael would chime in with the financial benefits. "It's in the heart of downtown, great investment potential. And think about it, no more yard work, no more maintenance issues, no more worrying about stairs. Everything on one level, everything taken care of." What they didn't say, but what hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, was that they expected to inherit that penthouse someday. They expected me to simplify my life so that theirs could become more complex, more luxurious, more aligned with their vision of success. The intervention meeting had been scheduled for this afternoon. Sarah had called it that, actually using the word intervention as if my attachment to my own home was some kind of addiction that needed to be broken. They'd enlisted reinforcements, David with his spreadsheets, Jennifer with her research on aging in place that somehow concluded I shouldn't be aging in my place, and even my sister Patricia, who'd driven up from California specifically to add her voice to the chorus of concern. "We're going to sit down and have an honest conversation about your future," Sarah had announced during her phone call yesterday. "We've all been talking, and we think it's time for some tough love. You're being stubborn about this, Mom, and stubbornness can be dangerous at your age. My age. 53. I'd been younger than that when I'd crawled through Taliban tunnels, when I'd carried wounded soldiers to safety, when I'd made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for my unit. But now, apparently I was too old and too fragile to make decisions about my own living situation. This morning, I'd done what any good soldier does when facing a battle. I'd gathered intelligence and made a strategic plan. The first call had been to my friend Janet Morrison, a real estate agent who'd served in the Navy before transitioning to civilian life. Janet understood the value of direct action and the importance of timing. "Becky, if you're serious about this, I can have the paperwork ready in 2 hours," she'd said when I outlined my situation. "But are you sure? That's a big decision to make in response to family pressure." "I'm not making it in response to pressure," I'd told her. "I'm making it in response to opportunity. They want me to downsize? Fine. But I'm going to downsize on my terms." The second call had been to Harborview Towers. The penthouse had been on the market for 6 months, a victim of its own luxury price point in a city where even tech workers were priced out of premium real estate. The seller was motivated, the listing agent told me. They'd consider offers, especially from qualified buyers who could close quickly. The third call had been to my financial advisor, confirming what I already knew. I had the resources to make this work. Military retirement pay, disability benefits, a healthy investment portfolio built on 22 years of disciplined saving, and yes, the equity in my current home. I could buy the penthouse outright and still have a comfortable cushion for the future. By 10 in the morning, I'd viewed the penthouse via video call, fallen in love with the soaring ceilings and endless views, and submitted an offer 15,000 below asking price. By noon, they'd accepted. By 2 o'clock, I'd signed a purchase agreement that would make me the owner of 800 square feet of luxury living space, 42 floors above the city I'd called home for 15 years. The beauty of the plan wasn't just in its audacity, it was in its perfect logic. They wanted me out of a house with stairs? Done. They thought I needed to liquidate my real estate assets? Accomplished. They believed I should move somewhere with security and amenities? Check, check, and check. What they hadn't counted on was that the woman who'd once outmaneuvered insurgents in the Afghan mountains might be able to outmaneuver her own children in the Portland real estate market. Wheeled myself to the living room window and looked out at the neighborhood I'd called home. Mrs. Chen was walking her golden retriever past the maple tree that I'd planted 5 years ago. The Johnsons were washing their car in their driveway, their twin daughters helping with more enthusiasm than skill. It was a good neighborhood, full of good people who'd never once made me feel like my prosthetic leg or my wheelchair made me less capable of being their neighbor. But it was also just a neighborhood, just a house, just wood and brick and memories that I could carry with me anywhere. What Sarah and Michael had never understood was that home wasn't about the building, it was about the choice to be there. And if they wanted to take away my choice, well, I'd make a different choice entirely. The irony was rich enough to savor. They'd pushed and prodded and planned, convinced that they were maneuvering me into a corner where I'd have no choice but to accept their vision of my future. Instead, they'd maneuvered themselves into a situation where their own dreams were about to be realized by the very person they'd been trying to control. I thought about the phone call I'd make after their intervention meeting, when they returned, home flushed with victory and ready to help me pack. I thought about the look on their faces when I told them that yes, I'd decided they were right about the house. Yes, I was ready to downsize. Yes, I'd already taken care of everything. And then, I thought about handing them the spare key to my new penthouse and watching them realize that sometimes, the person you underestimate most is the one who's been planning 3 moves ahead while you were still figuring out your opening gambit. The autumn sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that I'd soon be leaving behind. In a few hours, Sarah and Michael and their carefully assembled team would arrive for their intervention. They'd come armed with facts and figures, with concern and condescension, with the absolute certainty that they knew what was best for their disabled mother. They had no idea that their disabled mother had just purchased their dream home and was about to give them the most expensive lesson of their lives about the difference between being broken and being underestimated. The doorbell rang at exactly 3 o'clock, military precision that would have made my old drill sergeant proud. Through the front window, I could see them gathering like storm clouds on my porch. Sarah clutching a manila folder thick with research, Michael balancing his laptop bag and a stack of real estate printouts, David holding what looked like a presentation, binder, Jennifer with her phone already out and recording, probably for documentation purposes, and my sister Patricia looking uncomfortable but determined to play her role in this family drama. I'd changed into my dress uniform for the occasion. Not the full regalia, that would have been overkill, but the clean lines of my military bearing, the ribbons that told the story of my service, the purple heart that caught the afternoon light just right. If they wanted to treat this like a formal proceeding, I'd dress the part. Sometimes the best defense is reminding people exactly who they're dealing with. "Mom, you look official," Sarah said as she hugged me, her voice carrying that note of nervous disapproval I'd learned to recognize. She'd always been uncomfortable with my military identity, as if my service somehow reflected poorly on her civilian sensibilities. Growing up as an army brat had given her structure, discipline, and opportunities, but she'd spent her adult life distancing herself from anything that smacked of military culture. Michael kissed my cheek with the distracted air of a man checking items off a mental to-do list. Thanks for agreeing to this meeting, Mom. I know it might feel overwhelming, but we really think it's necessary. Overwhelming. The woman who'd once coordinated supply drops under enemy fire was going to be overwhelmed by a family meeting in her own living room. I wheeled myself to my usual spot by the fireplace, positioning myself where I could see everyone's faces and where the afternoon light would catch my ribbons and remind them, subtly, that I'd face down more serious opposition than a room full of concerned relatives. Patricia took the chair closest to me, her expression a careful mix of love and determination. My younger sister had always been the family diplomat, the one who smoothed over conflicts and found middle ground. At 49, she'd raised 3 kids, managed a successful accounting practice, and somehow maintained the illusion that every family problem could be solved with enough patience and the right conversation. "Becky, we're all here because we love you," she began, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who'd mediated countless disputes. "And because we're worried. Really, genuinely worried about your safety and your future." Sarah opened her manila folder with the flourish of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Mom, I've been researching statistics on in-home accidents among amputees over 50. The numbers are really concerning. Falls, emergency response delays, complications from living alone. The data shows that people in your situation have significantly better outcomes when they transition to more appropriate housing. More appropriate housing. As if the home I'd chosen, purchased, and maintained for 15 years had somehow become inappropriate the moment a roadside bomb took my leg. As if my Purple Heart was actually a scarlet letter marking me as unfit for independent living. Michael powered up his laptop with the efficiency of a man who'd clearly rehearsed this presentation. "I've run the numbers, Mom, and they're pretty compelling. Your current house has an estimated market value of $850,000. After realtor fees and closing costs, you'd net about $790,000. A nice ground floor condo in a senior community would run you maybe $300,000, leaving you with nearly $500,000 in liquid assets." Senior. Community. I was 53 years old, younger than some of the Marines I'd served with who were still doing active duty. But in Michael's financial calculations, I'd apparently aged into senior citizenship the moment I'd started using a wheelchair. For longer distances, David, ever the tech evangelist, had brought visual aids. He connected his tablet to my television and began cycling through photos of assisted living facilities that looked like luxury hotels, all soft lighting and beige furniture and smiling elderly residents engaged in what the marketing materials probably called enriching activities. "The quality of life improvements are really remarkable," he said, warming to his subject with the enthusiasm of someone who'd clearly never spent a day confined to institutional living. 24-hour medical staff, meal service, transportation, assistance, social activities, and the safety features, emergency call systems, grab bars, wheelchair accessibility throughout. It's really designed for optimal aging. Optimal aging. The phrase hung in the air like incense at a funeral. Sweet. And cloying and final. They were planning my decline with the same enthusiasm most people reserved for vacation planning, mapping out my deterioration with charts and graphs and cheerful brochures. Jennifer, who'd been documenting everything with her phone, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Martinez, I hope you don't mind that I've been taking some notes. I work in healthcare administration, and I see families dealing with these transitions all the time. The ones who plan ahead, who make proactive choices about care, options, they have much better outcomes than families who wait until there's a crisis." A crisis. Living independently in my own home had somehow become a crisis requiring intervention from a 25-year-old who'd never lived anywhere more challenging than her parents' basement. Sarah pulled out another set of documents, and I recognized the letterhead of Dr. William Hayes, the orthopedic surgeon who'd been managing my prosthetic adjustments. "Dr. Hayes agrees that your current living situation poses unnecessary risks. He's provided a letter outlining his concerns about your mobility limitations and the potential for serious injury from falls or emergencies. I'd have to have a conversation with Dr. Hayes about the ethics of discussing his patients' living situations with their adult children. The good doctor seemed to have forgotten that his job was to treat my leg, not to evaluate my housing choices. But that was a battle for another day. Patricia leaned forward, her expression earnest and pleading. Honey, I know this feels like we're ganging up on you. That's not what this is. We're trying to be responsible family members who are thinking about your long-term well-being. None of us wants to get a phone call saying you've fallen down those stairs and couldn't get help. The stairs again. Those 15 steps between the first and second floors of my house had become the villain in their narrative, a wooden and carpeted monster lying in wait to claim their helpless mother. Never mind that I'd been navigating them successfully for 3 years since my amputation. Never mind that I'd installed a chairlift for days when my prosthetic was being adjusted or when I was particularly tired. Never mind that I'd conquered mountains in Afghanistan that made my staircase look like a gentle slope. Michael pulled up a spreadsheet that looked like it had taken hours to create. I've also run some projections on your long-term care costs. If you stay in the house and eventually need in-home care, you're looking at anywhere from $3,000 to $8,000 a month, depending on the level of assistance required. Multiply that over 10 or 15 years, and you're talking about a significant financial burden. Financial burden. My own care, should I need it, had become a burden to be calculated and minimized. The money I'd saved over 2 decades of military service, the investments I'd made, the benefits I'd earned through blood and sacrifice, all of it was apparently better spent ensuring that they wouldn't have to worry about my future needs cutting into their inheritance. David advanced to the next slide in his presentation, revealing the Harbor View Tower's penthouse in all its luxury glory. The timing was perfect, almost choreographed. Now, we know you've always said you'd never want to live in a high-rise, but hear us out. This particular unit has some really unique features that might change your mind. Sarah jumped in with practiced enthusiasm. The building has amazing accessibility features. The elevators are extra wide, there are grab bars in all the bathrooms, and the doorways are all wheelchair accessible. Plus, the concierge service means you'd never have to worry about maintenance issues or emergency situations. Michael nodded along, his fingers dancing across his laptop keys. And from a financial perspective, it's actually a really smart investment. Downtown Portland real estate has been appreciating at about 8% annually. You could live there for 10 years and probably sell it for more than you paid. The beautiful irony was that they were selling me on my own purchase, describing the very apartment I'd bought 6 hours earlier, with the passion of people who'd clearly spent considerable time imagining themselves living there. They'd done their research, all right. They'd researched every square foot of luxury they wanted me to buy so they could eventually inherit it. Jennifer held up her phone, showing me photos she'd apparently taken during a previous visit to the building. I actually toured this unit last month with a client who was considering it for her mother. The views are absolutely incredible, and the building amenities are like having a resort at your doorstep. Gym, spa services, a rooftop garden, even a private dining room you can reserve for family gatherings. Family gatherings. I could picture it now. Holiday dinners in my penthouse dining room while they marveled at the views and calculated the square footage and discussed, in hushed tones, how much smarter this was than letting me waste away in my suburban house with its dangerous stairs and lack of built-in medical supervision. Patricia reached over and took my hand, her touch gentle but insistent. Becky, I know this is a lot to process. We're not asking you to decide today, but we are asking you to seriously consider what we're saying. We love you too much to watch you take unnecessary risks with your safety and your future. The love card. Always the trump in family. Negotiations. The one argument that couldn't be countered without seeming selfish or ungrateful. They loved me too much to let me live independently. They loved me too much to respect my choices. They loved me too much to treat me like an adult capable of making my own decisions. Sarah pulled out one final document, a power of attorney form, that would give her and Michael joint authority over my financial and medical decisions. "We're not saying you need this right now, Mom, but we think it might be smart to have something in place, just in case, for emergencies." Just in case. The phrase that had launched 1,000 surrenders, the bureaucratic equivalent of a white flag. Just in case you become incompetent. Just in case you can't make good decisions. Just in case the family needs to step in and save you from yourself. The room fell silent as they waited for my response. 5 people who claimed to love me, who'd spent months planning this intervention, who'd researched and calculated and strategized their way to this moment where they expected me to fold, to surrender, to accept their vision of my diminished future. I looked around the room at their expectant faces, at the carefully prepared presentations and the rehearsed arguments and the unified front they'd presented. They'd done their homework all right. They'd covered every angle, anticipated every objection, prepared for every contingency. Except one. They'd never considered the possibility that the woman they were trying to save from herself might have been planning her own operation while they were planning theirs. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, watching their faces as confidence slowly gave way to confusion. In military operations, timing is everything. You wait for the perfect moment, when the enemy has committed to their position and can't easily retreat. This was that moment. "You've all put a tremendous amount of work into this presentation," I said finally, my voice carrying the measured tone I'd once used to brief commanding officers. "The research is thorough, the financial analysis is detailed, and your concern for my well-being is noted." Sarah's shoulders relaxed slightly. She thought I was capitulating, that the weight of their unified argument had broken through my stubborn resistance. Michael leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just closed a difficult sale. David began organizing his presentation materials, already mentally moving on to the next phase of their plan. "However," I continued, and the word hit the room like a mortar round, "there are some aspects of this situation that you haven't fully considered." Patricia frowned, her diplomatic instincts sensing a shift in the tactical situation. "What do you mean, honey?" I wheeled myself closer to the center of the room, positioning myself where I could see all of them clearly. "Well, for starters, you've all made the assumption that I'm unaware of my own limitations, that I haven't spent the last 3 years carefully evaluating my living situation and making adjustments as needed." Jennifer held up her phone, as if the device might somehow capture and catalog whatever I was about to say. "But Mrs. Martinez, the statistics clearly show that people in your situation benefit from structured support systems." "Statistics?" I interrupted, my voice taking on the edge that had once silenced entire platoons. "Let me share some statistics. With you, Jennifer." In my 22 years of military service, I led evacuation operations in hostile territory 17 times. I coordinated medical emergencies under enemy fire on 11 occasions. I managed supply chains for forward operating bases that kept thousands of soldiers fed, armed, and equipped for months at a time. Would you like to calculate the statistical probability of someone with my operational experience being unable to manage a 15-step staircase? The room went quiet. David's fingers stopped moving across his tablet screen. Michael's laptop suddenly seemed to require his complete attention. Sarah's manila folder remained unopened on her lap. But more importantly, I continued, you've all made another assumption that's even more problematic. You've assumed that I haven't been paying attention to what's really driving this intervention. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Becky, I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything, Pat. I'm stating it directly. This isn't about my safety. This isn't about my limitations. This is about $850,000 in real estate equity and a penthouse apartment that some people in this room have been coveting for the better part of a year." The silence that followed was different from the expectant, quiet of a few minutes earlier. This was the silence of people who'd just realized their carefully constructed narrative was falling apart in real time. Sarah was the first to recover, her psychology training kicking in with practiced deflection. "Mom, that's not fair." "Yes, we've looked at the penthouse as a potential option for you, but only because we think it would be perfect for your needs. We're not scheming to inherit your property. We're trying to help you make a smart decision about your future. Smart decision?" I repeated, letting the phrase hang in the air. "Tell me, Sarah, when you and David toured that penthouse last month—" "Yes, I know about that. Were you evaluating it for my needs, or were you imagining yourselves living there?" David's face flushed red. "Mrs. Martinez, I think you're misunderstanding. Our motivations— Am I? Michael, how many times have you shown me the financial projections for that building? How many times have you mentioned the investment potential, the appreciation rates, the long-term value proposition? Those aren't the concerns of someone worried about their mother's immediate housing needs. Those are the calculations of someone planning a real estate portfolio." Michael's laptop screen reflected the late afternoon light, casting geometric shadows across his face. "Mom, you're taking this the wrong way. Yes, I think it's a good investment. That doesn't mean I'm trying to manipulate you into buying it for selfish reasons." I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Selfish reasons. Let's talk about selfish reasons, shall we? Jennifer, you work in healthcare administration. What's the average cost of a penthouse apartment in Harborview Towers? Jennifer looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. I'm not sure of the exact figures. $800,000, I said. The exact same amount you'd all calculated I'd net from selling this house. Convenient, isn't it? The perfect solution to my housing problem just happens to cost exactly what my current house is worth. Patricia tried to regain control of the conversation, her voice taking on the soothing tone she'd perfected during years of family crisis management. "Honey, even if the numbers work out that way, it doesn't mean anyone has ulterior motives. Sometimes coincidences are just coincidences." "Coincidences," I mused. "Like the coincidence that this intervention is scheduled for today, 3 days before the Harborview penthouse listing expires? Like the coincidence that you've all coordinated your schedules to be here at the same time, with prepared presentations and legal documents? Like the coincidence that Dr. Hayes suddenly developed concerns about my living situation right after Michael made an appointment to discuss my care needs with him?" The last revelation hit the room like a flashbang grenade. Michael's face went pale, and Sarah's carefully composed expression cracked for just a moment before she recovered her psychological training persona. That's not what happened," Michael stammered. "I mean, yes, I spoke with Dr. Hayes, but only because we were concerned about getting professional medical advice." "Professional medical advice about what, exactly?" "My doctor's appointments are confidential, Michael. The fact that Dr. Hayes discussed my case with you without my written consent is a violation of federal privacy laws. Unless, of course, you misrepresented your authority to make medical decisions on my behalf." The silence stretched until it became painful. Sarah's manila folder rustled as her hands trembled slightly. David had stopped pretending to organize his presentation materials and was staring at his shoes with the intensity of a man trying to disappear through sheer force of will. Jennifer finally broke the quiet, her voice small and uncertain. "Maybe we should take a break? This seems to be getting more heated than anyone intended." "Heated?" I wheeled closer to the center of the room, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd once commanded respect through competence rather than manipulation. "Jennifer, let me tell you what heated looks like. Heated is when someone uses your medical information without permission to build a case for declaring you incompetent. Heated is when your own children coordinate behind your back to pressure you into liquidating your assets for their benefit. Heated is when people who claim to love you treat you like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected." Patricia stood up, her diplomatic composure finally cracking. "Becky, that's enough. We're your family. We came here out of love and concern, And you're treating us like we're criminals. Yes, we've been talking among ourselves about your situation. That's what families do when they're worried about someone they care about. What families do, I repeated, my voice dropping to the controlled whisper that had once preceded some of my most decisive military actions, is respect each other's autonomy. What families do is ask instead of demand. What families do is support each other's choices instead of conspiring to undermine them. Sarah finally opened her manila folder, pulling out a document I hadn't seen before. Mom, since you want to talk about respect and autonomy, maybe you should know that we've consulted with an elder law attorney about your situation. If you're determined to make dangerous choices about your living situation, there are legal options for family members who are concerned about competency issues. The threat hung in the air like cordite smoke. They'd moved beyond manipulation and persuasion into the realm of legal coercion. The power of attorney document they'd brought wasn't just a precaution for emergencies. It was the foundation for a competency challenge that could strip away my legal right to make my own decisions. An elder law attorney, I said, my voice deadly calm. Interesting. What did this attorney tell you about the legal requirements for challenging someone's competency? David looked up from his shoes, perhaps sensing that the conversation had moved into territory where his business background might be relevant. Well, there have to be documented incidents of poor judgment, medical evidence of cognitive decline, evidence that the person is a danger to themselves or others? Medical evidence, I interrupted. You mean like the letter from Dr. Hayes that you obtained through what I'm now certain was fraudulent representation? The letter discussing my private medical information without my consent? Michael's laptop made a soft chiming sound, but he ignored it completely. His financial calculations and real estate projections suddenly seemed much less important than the legal minefield he'd helped create. And documented incidents of poor judgment, I continued. Like refusing to sell my house and move into assisted living? Like wanting to maintain my independence despite having a prosthetic leg? Like declining to sign over financial authority to my adult children? Sarah's psychology training had taught her to recognize when a therapeutic intervention was going sideways, but it apparently hadn't prepared her for what to do when the patient turned out to be more psychologically astute than the therapist. Mom, you're twisting everything we've said. We're not trying to take away your rights. We're trying to protect you from making decisions that could hurt you in the long run. Protect me, I said, wheeling backward toward the fireplace where my military commendations caught the afternoon light. Let me tell you about protection, Sarah. Protection is body armor and tactical awareness and contingency planning. Protection is preparing for multiple scenarios and maintaining operational security. Protection is not assuming that the people around you have your best interests at heart without verifying their motivations. I paused, letting my gaze move from face to face, cataloging the various expressions of discomfort, guilt, and dawning realization that their carefully planned operation was not proceeding according to script. What you're describing isn't protection, I continued. It's control. And the irony is that while you've all been so busy planning how to control my future, you've made a fundamental tactical error. Patricia sat back down, her expression wary. What kind of error? I smiled for the first time since they'd arrived, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. You've assumed that I've been sitting here passively, waiting for you to decide my fate. You've assumed that the woman who once outmaneuvered enemy combatants in Afghanistan wouldn't be capable of outmaneuvering her own family in Portland, Oregon. The laptop chimed again, and this time Michael glanced at the screen. His face went from pale to ashen as he read whatever message had just appeared. You've assumed, I said, watching his reaction with professional interest, that I would wait for your intervention before taking action on my own behalf. Jennifer lowered her phone, apparently sensing that whatever was about to happen wasn't something she wanted to document for posterity. Most importantly, I concluded, you've assumed that I didn't know exactly what you were planning and exactly why you were planning it. That assumption, I'm afraid, is about to cost you more than you ever imagined. Michael's face had gone completely white as he stared at his laptop screen. The soft chiming continued, notification after notification appearing. With the relentless persistence of incoming artillery, his fingers trembled as he scrolled through what I could only assume were real estate alerts, market updates, and possibly some very unwelcome news about a certain penthouse apartment. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking like a teenager's. Did you do something today?" I folded my hands in my lap with the practiced composure of someone who'd spent decades delivering mission briefings to rooms full of skeptical officers. "That's an interesting question, Michael. Are you asking if I took some kind of action regarding my living situation? Because if that's what you're asking, then yes, I did do something today." Sarah leaned forward, her manila folder forgotten, as she tried to read her brother's laptop screen upside down. "What kind of something? Mom, please tell me you didn't make any major decisions without talking to us first." The irony was so thick I could practically taste it. They'd spent months making decisions about my future without talking to me, but apparently I was supposed to consult them before making decisions about my own life. "Major decisions," I repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting phrase. I suppose it depends on your perspective. From my point of view, I made some perfectly reasonable decisions about my housing situation. From your perspective, well, I imagine it might seem somewhat disruptive." David had abandoned any pretense of organizing his presentation materials and was now openly staring at Michael's laptop screen. The color drained from his face as he apparently began to understand what he was seeing. "Mrs. Martinez," he said carefully, "when you say you made decisions about your housing situation, do you mean you've decided to consider our suggestions? Because if you're ready to start looking at options, we'd be happy to help you coordinate. The process?" I laughed, a sound with more genuine amusement than I'd felt in months. "Oh, David, I've already coordinated the process. In fact, I'd say the process went remarkably smoothly. Much more smoothly than this intervention, I have to say." Patricia stood up again, her diplomatic training clearly struggling to process a situation that had moved far beyond the scope of family mediation. "Becky, what exactly did you do today? And please, just give us a straight answer." I looked around. The room, at their anxious faces, at the carefully prepared presentations that were now completely irrelevant, at the power of attorney documents that would never be signed, at the intervention that had become something else entirely. "This morning," I began, my voice carrying the measured cadence of a military debrief, "I received a phone call from Janet Morrison. You remember Janet, don't you, Pat? She served in the Navy before she became a real estate agent. Excellent service. Record, impeccable integrity, and most importantly for today's purposes, she understands the value of operational security and rapid deployment." Jennifer's phone was still in her hand, but she'd stopped recording. Apparently, even she could sense that this conversation was moving into territory that might not be appropriate for documentation. Janet called to confirm that the paperwork for my real estate transaction had been processed and that all the necessary approvals were in place. Very efficient woman, Janet. Gets things done while other people are still talking about getting things done. Michael's laptop chimed again, and he made a strangled sound that might have been an attempt at speech. Sarah grabbed his arm, trying to see what had captured his attention so completely. "Real estate transaction," Sarah repeated, slowly, as if the words might make more sense if she said them carefully enough. "Mom, what real estate transaction?" I wheeled myself closer to the window, where the late afternoon sun illuminated the neighborhood I'd called home for 15 years. Mrs. Chen was walking her golden retriever again, probably the dog's second walk of the day. The Johnsons had finished washing their car and were now raking leaves in their front yard. Normal suburban activities, the kind of peaceful routine that my family apparently believed I was too disabled to navigate safely. "Well," I said, turning back to face the room, "you've all spent considerable time explaining to me why this house is inappropriate for my needs. Too many stairs, too much maintenance, too much space for one person. Too many safety hazards. I have to admit, after listening to your presentation, I began to see your point. Patricia sat back down heavily, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror. Oh no. Becky, please tell me you didn't what? Didn't take your advice? Didn't address the safety concerns you've been raising? Didn't make a responsible decision about downsizing my living situation? David's tablet slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor, but he made no move to retrieve it. His face had taken on the greenish pallor of someone who'd just realized they'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. I listed the house this morning, I continued conversationally. Janet had a buyer lined up within 2 hours. Cash offer, no contingencies, closing in 30 days. Amazing how quickly things move when you're working with motivated parties. The silence that followed was different from any of the previous silences in the room. This wasn't expectant quiet or uncomfortable pause or tactical positioning. This was the silence of people watching their carefully constructed plans collapse in real time. Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. You sold the house. I'm selling the house, I corrected. The transaction won't be final for 30 days, but yes, I've accepted an offer. $790,000, which is exactly what Michael calculated I'd net after fees and closing costs. His financial analysis was quite accurate, actually. Michael finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate. But Mom, where are you going to live? You can't just sell your house without having somewhere else to go. This is insane. Insane. The woman who'd managed complex military logistics was insane for handling her own real estate transaction. The veteran who'd coordinated multi-million-dollar supply operations was insane for making a financial decision without consulting her children. That's an excellent question, Michael. Where am I going to live? Well, since you've all been so enthusiastic about the benefits of downtown living, I thought I'd take your advice on that front as well. Jennifer had gone completely still, her phone forgotten in her lap. David was staring at the wall behind me as if it might offer some escape from the conversation. Patricia was gripping the arms of her chair with white knuckles. I purchased a downtown condominium this afternoon, I said, enjoying the way the words hit the room like individual grenades. Excellent location, panoramic views, all the amenities you've been telling me I need. 24-hour security, concierge service, wheelchair accessibility throughout. Really? It checks all the boxes you've been so concerned about. Sarah's manila folder slipped from her lap and scattered papers across the floor. Financial projections and medical recommendations and assisted living brochures spread across the hardwood like fallen leaves. Which building? She asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. I smiled with genuine pleasure for the first time in months. Harbor View Towers, 42nd floor, the penthouse unit that you've all been showing me pictures of for the past 6 months. Turns out the seller was very motivated. They accepted my offer this afternoon. The explosion, when it came, was everything I'd hoped for and more. You bought our penthouse? Sarah shrieked, her psychological training abandoning her completely as she leaped to her feet. That was supposed to be, we were going to... How could you do that? Our penthouse. The words hung in the air like a confession. Not my penthouse, not the penthouse they'd recommended for me, but their penthouse. The penthouse they'd been planning. To inherit, to live in, to use as the foundation for their own upgraded lifestyle. Michael was making sounds that might have been words if they'd been organized differently. His laptop screen showed what I assumed were real estate alerts confirming that the Harbor View penthouse was no longer available, that their dream home had been purchased by someone else while they'd been sitting in my living room trying to manipulate me into buying it for them. David had gone completely silent, staring at his hands as if they might provide some explanation for how his carefully researched investment opportunity had just evaporated. Jennifer was looking between her phone and the scattered papers on the floor, apparently trying to decide whether this was still worth documenting. Patricia was the first to recover her composure, though her voice shook with barely controlled emotion. Becky, this is vindictive. This is cruel. We came here out of genuine concern for your well-being, and you've turned it into some kind of elaborate revenge scheme. Revenge? The word tasted sweet on my tongue, though I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of showing it. Revenge? I said, my voice carrying the innocent confusion of someone who genuinely didn't understand the accusation. Patricia, I'm not sure what you mean. You've all spent months telling me that I need to downsize, that I need better security, that I need to liquidate my real estate assets and move somewhere more appropriate for my age and physical limitations. I've done exactly what you asked. Sarah was pacing now, her hands gesturing wildly as her careful psychological composure crumbled completely. You know exactly what you've done. You bought that penthouse specifically to keep us from having it. You're punishing us for caring about you. Caring. The word had lost all meaning after months of manipulation disguised as concern. Punishing you? Sarah, I bought a condominium that meets all the criteria you've been insisting are necessary for my safety and well-being. I'm moving to a building with medical staff on call, maintenance service, security, and no stairs to navigate. Isn't this exactly what you wanted? Michael finally managed to form coherent words, though they came out in a rush of panic and disbelief. But we were planning to... we thought that eventually. The inheritance implications alone. He stopped himself before he could finish the sentence, but the damage was done. The inheritance implications. The careful financial planning that had assumed I'd buy the penthouse and live there quietly until they could inherit it and upgrade their own lives with the proceeds. Inheritance implications, I repeated thoughtfully. Michael, are you concerned about your inheritance? Because if that's what this is about, I should probably mention that I've also updated my estate planning today. The room went so quiet, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, each second marking the dissolution of their carefully constructed plans. I have established a trust, I continued, that will ensure my assets are distributed according to my values and priorities. Veterans organizations will receive substantial donations. The VA hospital where I volunteer will benefit significantly. There are provisions for education funding for military children. Really, it's quite comprehensive. David made a sound that might have been a sob or might have been a laugh. It was hard to tell which. And family? Patricia asked, her voice barely audible. I considered the question with the same careful attention I'd once given to tactical assessments under fire. Family members who demonstrate respect for my autonomy and genuine concern for my well-being will be remembered appropriately. Family members who attempt to manipulate, control, or defraud me will find that actions have consequences. Sarah stopped pacing and turned to face me directly, her face flushed with anger and disbelief. This is blackmail. You're holding our inheritance hostage to force us to accept your stubborn refusal to acknowledge your limitations. Blackmail, extortion, manipulation. They were accusing me of the very tactics they'd been using for months, apparently without recognizing the irony. Sarah, I said, my voice carrying the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a slow student. This isn't blackmail. This is accountability. You've spent months treating me like an incompetent child who needed to be managed and controlled. You've violated my medical privacy, planned to challenge my legal competency, and attempted to coerce me into financial decisions that would benefit you more than me. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences? Jennifer finally spoke up, her voice small and uncertain. Mrs. Martinez, I think maybe we should all take a step back and try to find some common ground here. This has gotten more confrontational than anyone intended. I turned to look at her directly. This young woman who'd been documenting my supposed incompetence for reasons I still didn't fully understand. Jennifer, why are you here? What's your role in this intervention? Because I'm curious about why my son's girlfriend, who lives in her parents' basement, thinks she's qualified to evaluate my living situation. The question hit her like a physical blow. Her phone slipped from her hands and clattered to the floor next to David's forgotten tablet. Michael asked me to come. He thought maybe a healthcare perspective would be helpful. A healthcare perspective, I mused. From someone who works in healthcare administration. Not a doctor, not a nurse, not a physical therapist, but someone who processes paperwork for a living. And you thought you were qualified to assess my medical needs? The afternoon sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the living room that would soon be someone else's living room. In 30 days, I'd be gone from this house, and they'd be left to contemplate the wreckage of their plans in whatever rental properties they could afford. Here's what's going to happen now, I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades giving orders that were followed without question. You're all going to leave my house. You're going to take your presentations and your legal documents and your fake concern, and you're going to go home and think about what you've learned today. Michael's laptop chimed one more time, a sound that made him flinch as if he'd been struck. And if any of you ever again attempt to interfere with my legal rights, my medical privacy, or my financial decisions, you'll discover that the woman who once defended this country is more than capable of defending herself. The room was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the soft sound of papers rustling as Sarah began gathering her scattered documents from the floor. The first person to move was Jennifer, who scrambled to collect her phone from the floor with the desperate urgency of someone trying to escape a combat zone. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the device, nearly dropping it again before finally managing to slip it into her purse. The young woman who'd arrived with such confidence in her healthcare administration expertise now looked like she wanted to disappear through the hardwood floors. David remained frozen in his chair, staring at his forgotten tablet as if it might somehow reverse the afternoon's revelations. His carefully prepared presentation about the benefits of assisted living had become irrelevant in the span of a single conversation, and his tech industry confidence had evaporated like morning fog in desert heat. Sarah was gathering her scattered papers with mechanical precision, her psychology training finally kicking in as she tried to process what had just happened. But her hands trembled as she stuffed documents back into her manila folder, and I could see the moment when the full implications of my announcement began to sink in. The penthouse they'd been coveting, the inheritance they'd been counting on, the control they'd been seeking, all of it had slipped through their fingers while they'd been sitting in my living room trying to manipulate me. Michael was still staring at his laptop screen, watching real estate alerts that confirmed his worst fears. The Harbor View Towers penthouse was officially off the market, sold to a cash buyer who'd closed the deal while he'd been calculating mortgage projections and inheritance timelines. His financial spreadsheets and investment analyses had become worthless in the time it took me to make a single phone call. Patricia was the first to find her voice, though it came out strained and uncertain. Becky, I think we need to talk about this more. Maybe not today, maybe not right now, but soon. This is too big, too important to let it end like this. I wheeled myself closer to the window again, watching Mrs. Chen return from her second dog walk of the day. The golden retriever was pulling toward our house, probably hoping for the treats I usually kept in my pocket. Simple pleasures, uncomplicated relationships. The dog didn't care about my prosthetic leg or my medical privacy or my real estate decisions. He just wanted a biscuit and maybe a scratch behind the ears. Patricia, I said without turning around, what exactly do you think we need to talk about? The fact that you all coordinated behind my back to pressure me into giving up my independence? The fact that you brought legal documents designed to strip away my decision-making authority? The fact that you've been treating me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected? She stood up slowly, her diplomatic training struggling to find some middle ground in a situation that had moved far beyond compromise. We made mistakes, obviously. The approach was wrong, the timing was wrong, maybe the whole thing was wrong. But the underlying concern was real, Becky. We are worried about you. We do care about your safety and your future. Care, concern, worry. The words had lost their meaning after months of manipulation disguised as family love. They'd been worried about me the same way vultures worry about wounded animals, with patient anticipation rather than genuine compassion. "Your concern," I said, finally turning back to face the room, "was noted and filed appropriately. Your approach to addressing that concern, however, was unacceptable. Military operations fail when soldiers don't trust their commanding officers. Families fail when members don't respect each other's autonomy." Sarah finally succeeded in stuffing all her papers back into the manila folder, though several sheets were now crumpled and torn from her frantic gathering efforts. She clutched the folder against her chest like armor, as if it might somehow protect her from the consequences of the afternoon's revelations. "Mom, you can't seriously be planning to cut us out of your life over this. We're your children. We made some poor choices about how to express our concerns, but that doesn't mean we don't love you. It doesn't mean we don't deserve a chance to make things right. Love. The ultimate trump card in family negotiations. The one argument that was supposed to end all other arguments. But love without respect was just another form of control, and I'd had enough of being controlled to last several lifetimes. Sarah, let me tell you about love in military families. When a soldier deploys, their family loves them enough to let them go. When a veteran comes home injured, their family loves them enough to support their recovery without trying to manage every aspect of their rehabilitation. When a parent ages, their adult children love them enough to respect their choices, even when those choices involve some risk. I paused, letting the words settle in the room like dust after an explosion. What you've shown me isn't love, Sarah. It's fear. Fear that I might make decisions you don't approve of. Fear that I might not need you as much as you think I should. Fear that your inheritance might not be as substantial as you'd hoped. But mostly, fear that the woman who raised you might be stronger and more capable than you want to believe. Michael finally closed his laptop with a sharp snap that echoed through the quiet room. His face had progressed from pale to gray, and his business school confidence had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. "Mom, okay, maybe we handled this wrong. Maybe we should have approached it differently. But you have to understand, from our perspective, you were being stubborn about obvious safety issues. The stairs, the isolation, the lack of immediate medical support. Those are real concerns, not imaginary problems we made up to manipulate you. Stubborn. The word that had followed me through childhood, through military service, through marriage and divorce and single parenthood. My stubbornness had kept me alive in combat zones and helped me rebuild my life after losing my leg. But apparently, that same quality became a character flaw when it interfered with my children's plans for my future. Michael, stubbornness is what got me through 2 tours in Afghanistan. Stubbornness is what kept me walking after the bomb took my leg. Stubbornness is what built the savings account you've been eyeing and paid for the house you wanted me to sell. Maybe the problem isn't that I'm too stubborn. Maybe the problem is that you're not stubborn enough to build your own life instead of trying to inherit mine. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of David finally retrieving his tablet from the floor. The device's screen was cracked, spiderwebbing across the harbor view photos he'd been using to sell me on my own purchase. He stared at the damaged screen for a moment, then looked up at me with something that might have been grudging respect. "Mrs. Martinez, I have to ask. How long have you been planning this?" Because the timing, the coordination, the way you had everything ready to go, this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. I smiled at him, the first genuine smile I'd offered anyone in the room all afternoon. "David, that's an excellent question. The answer is that I've been watching and listening and planning since the first time you all sat around my dinner table discussing my situation, like I wasn't in the room. Military intelligence gathering doesn't end when you retire from active duty." Jennifer had managed to stand up and was edging toward the door with the careful movements of someone trying to escape without drawing attention. But she stopped when I mentioned intelligence gathering, apparently realizing that her own role in the afternoon's events might deserve some explanation. Mrs. Martinez, I want you to know that I never meant any harm. Michael asked me to come because he thought a healthcare perspective would be helpful, but I realize now that I wasn't qualified to make judgments about your living situation. I'm sorry if I overstepped. Healthcare perspective. From someone whose healthcare experience consisted of processing insurance claims and scheduling appointments. The apology was probably genuine, which made it more irritating than the manipulation attempts from my own family members. Jennifer, let me give you some free career advice. In healthcare administration, you process paperwork. You don't make clinical assessments. You don't evaluate patients' living situations. And you definitely don't participate in family interventions designed to strip away someone's legal rights. Stick to what you know. Patricia had been quiet during the last few exchanges, but now she stepped forward with the determined expression of someone making one final diplomatic effort. Becky, I know you're angry. You have every right to be angry. But think about what you're doing here. Think about the long-term consequences of burning bridges with your own children over a misunderstanding about intentions. Misunderstanding. As if months of coordination and manipulation and legal maneuvering could be dismissed as a simple miscommunication between well-meaning family members. Patricia, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is a fundamental disagreement about whether I have the right to make my own decisions about my own life. They believe I don't. I believe I do. There's no middle ground on that particular issue. Sarah clutched her manila folder tighter and took a step toward me, her voice rising with desperation. But Mom, what happens now? You're really going to move into that penthouse and pretend we don't exist? You're going to throw away 30 years of family relationships because we made some mistakes about how to help you? Help. Another word that had been twisted beyond recognition during the afternoon's proceedings. They'd been helping me the same way con artists help their marks make better financial decisions. Sarah, I'm not throwing away anything. I'm establishing boundaries. I'm making it clear that my life belongs to me, not to you. If you want to rebuild our relationship, you can start by respecting my autonomy and apologizing for violating my privacy and attempting to manipulate my decisions. Michael stood up abruptly, his laptop bag swinging from his shoulder as he struggled to process the complete collapse of his carefully calculated plans. This is insane, Mom. You're acting like we're criminals or something. We're your family. We were trying to help you make smart decisions about your future. Smart decisions. Like selling my house and buying a penthouse so they could eventually inherit downtown real estate instead of suburban property. Like signing over financial authority so they could manage my assets according to their priorities rather than mine. Michael, criminals break the law. What you've done is legal, if morally questionable. You used family relationships to gain access to private medical information. You coordinated with multiple parties to pressure me into financial decisions that would benefit you. You brought legal documents designed to strip away my decision-making authority. All of that is technically legal, which makes it worse, not better. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 5 times, marking the passage of time that had transformed an intervention into something else entirely. The afternoon light was fading, casting longer shadows across the living room that would soon belong to someone else. David finally spoke up again, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity mixed with what might have been professional admiration. Mrs. Martinez, can I ask how you knew? I mean, we thought we were being pretty subtle about our concerns and suggestions. How did you figure out what we were really planning? Subtle. They'd been about as subtle as a tank battalion conducting urban warfare exercises. But I suppose civilian families didn't learn the same lessons about operational security that military families absorbed through necessity. David, you showed me the same penthouse listing 17 times in 3 months. Michael mentioned the investment potential every time we had a conversation about real estate. Sarah brought up my safety concerns whenever I mentioned any activity more challenging than watching television. Jennifer documented conversations without my permission. Patricia coordinated with my children behind my back while pretending to be a neutral family mediator. If that's subtle, I'd hate to see your idea of an obvious manipulation campaign. The room fell quiet again as they processed the extent to which their careful planning had been transparent to the person they'd been trying to manipulate. Military. Training teaches you to observe patterns, to recognize coordinated efforts, to identify threats before they become critical. My family had been conducting a campaign against my independence with all the stealth of a marching band. Jennifer had reached the door and was fumbling with the handle, clearly desperate to escape the wreckage of the afternoon's events. But she turned back one more time, perhaps realizing that her departure might seem too abrupt. "Mrs. Martinez, I really am sorry. I hope things work out well for you in your new home." New home. The penthouse they'd all been dreaming about. The luxury apartment they'd been planning to inherit. The downtown lifestyle they'd been coveting while pretending to worry about my suburban safety. I was about to live their dream while they tried to figure out how to afford their own rent. "Thank you, Jennifer. I'm sure they will. The views are supposed to be spectacular." Jennifer slipped out the door with the quiet desperation of someone escaping a disaster zone, leaving the 4 remaining family members to contemplate the wreckage of their carefully orchestrated intervention. The soft click of the door closing behind her seemed to break whatever spell had been holding the room in suspended animation. David was the next to move, gathering his cracked tablet and presentation materials with the mechanical efficiency of someone going through familiar motions. While his mind processed an entirely unfamiliar situation, his tech industry confidence had been replaced by something that looked like shell shock, as if he couldn't quite believe that his data-driven approach to solving my housing problem had backfired so spectacularly. "Mrs. Martinez," he said carefully, "I think I should probably go too. This feels like a conversation that should stay within the family." He paused at the door, his hand on the handle, then turned back with what might have been genuine curiosity. "But can I ask you something? That penthouse, are you really going to be happy there? I mean, it's beautiful, but it's so different from this place. Won't you miss the garden, the neighborhood, the community you've built here?" It was, I had to admit, a more thoughtful question than I'd expected from someone who'd spent the afternoon trying to sell me on the benefits of concierge living. And it was the first question anyone had asked that seemed to be about my actual preferences rather than their assumptions about what I should want. "David, I spent 22 years living wherever the Army sent me. Barracks, temporary housing, forward operating bases, family quarters that looked exactly like every other set of family quarters on every other military installation. I learned a long time ago that home isn't about the building. It's about having the freedom to choose where you want to be." He nodded slowly, apparently processing this information through whatever mental framework he used to understand human motivations that couldn't be reduced to spreadsheets and market analyses. "The penthouse," I continued, "represents something your presentation materials never captured. It represents my right to make my own decisions about my own life, even when those decisions seem irrational to other people. Even when those decisions disappoint people who had different plans for my future." Sarah was still clutching her manila folder, but she'd stopped trying to organize its contents. Instead, she was staring at me with the expression of someone trying to reconcile the mother she thought she knew with the tactical strategist who'd just outmaneuvered her entire family. "Mom, I keep thinking about what you said about intelligence gathering. How long have you been watching us? Planning this? Because it feels like you've been 3 steps ahead of us this whole time." 3 steps ahead. In military terms, I'd been conducting a defensive operation while they'd been planning what they thought was a humanitarian intervention. The difference was that I'd understood it was a conflict from the beginning, while they'd believed their own propaganda about family concern and medical necessity. "Sarah, I've been watching since the first time you and Michael had a private conversation about my situation after I lost my leg. I've been listening since the first time someone mentioned that my house was too much for me to handle. I've been planning since the first time someone suggested that I might be better off in a more appropriate living situation." Michael had been quiet since his laptop revelation, but now he looked up with something that might have been grudging respect mixed with genuine confusion. But Mom, if you knew what we were thinking, why didn't you just tell us to back off? Why let it get to this point? Why not just have an honest conversation about boundaries instead of this? Honest conversation. As if honest conversations were possible with people who'd been coordinating behind my back for months, who'd accessed my medical information without permission, who'd brought legal documents designed to strip away my autonomy. Michael, I tried. Honest conversations. Every time you brought up the penthouse, I told you I wasn't interested. Every time Sarah mentioned safety concerns, I explained how I'd adapted my living situation to accommodate my prosthetic. Every time someone suggested I was being stubborn about obvious problems, I tried to explain that I was being careful about obvious manipulation. Patricia had been unusually quiet during the last few exchanges, but now she stepped forward with the measured approach of someone making one final diplomatic effort. Her face showed the strain of watching a family intervention transform into something that looked more like a military debriefing. Becky, I understand that you felt cornered, that you felt like we weren't listening to your perspective. But don't you think this response is a little extreme? Buying the penthouse specifically to keep it away from Sarah and Michael, restructuring your estate planning, threatening to cut off family relationships. Isn't that taking things too far? Extreme. The woman who'd once coordinated medical evacuations under enemy fire was being extreme for making her own housing decisions and protecting her own financial interests. Patricia, let me tell you about extreme. Extreme is accessing someone's confidential medical information to build a case for declaring them incompetent. Extreme is coordinating with multiple family members to pressure someone into liquidating their primary asset. Extreme is bringing legal documents to strip away someone's decision-making authority. What I've done isn't extreme. It's proportional. The afternoon light was fading now, casting the living room in the golden hues of late autumn. Outside, I could see Mr. Johnson raking leaves in his front yard while his twin daughters jumped in the pile he'd just created. Normal family activities. The kind of uncomplicated interactions that my own family seemed incapable of maintaining. Sarah finally spoke up, her voice carrying a note of desperation that her psychology training couldn't quite mask. But Mom, what happens to us now? I mean, we can't afford anything like that penthouse on our own. David and I have been saving for a down payment for 3 years, and we're still nowhere close to being able to buy in that neighborhood. We were counting on... we thought that eventually. The word that had driven months of manipulation and family coordination. They'd been planning my future based on their eventual inheritance, calculating their own financial security against my anticipated mortality. Sarah, what happens to you now is what should have been happening all along. You figure out how to build your own life with your own resources. You make your own financial decisions based on your own priorities. You stop treating my assets like your inheritance and start treating your future like your responsibility. Michael was packing up his laptop with the careful movements of someone trying to maintain dignity in an impossible situation. But he kept glancing at me with an expression that suggested he was still trying to process how completely his financial projections had been derailed by factors he hadn't anticipated. Mom, I get that you're angry about how we approached this. I get that we made mistakes in how we communicated our concerns. But the underlying financial analysis was sound. That house is worth a fortune, and maintaining it is expensive. The penthouse would have been a smart investment, and yes, eventually, it would have been something that benefited the whole family. Was it really wrong to think about the future, implications of your housing decisions? Smart investment, future implications, whole family. The language of someone who'd been treating my life like a business plan rather than recognizing it as my personal experience to navigate according to my own values and preferences. Michael, the financial analysis was sound if the goal was to maximize the value of your eventual inheritance. It was less sound if the goal was to support my independence and respect my preferences. Those are two different objectives, and they lead to very different conclusions about what constitutes a smart decision. David had finished gathering his materials and was standing by the door, apparently waiting for some signal that the conversation was actually over. His cracked tablet screen reflected the evening light, creating fragmented images of the harbor view photos he'd used to sell me on my own purchase. Mrs. Martinez, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I think what you've done today is actually pretty impressive from a strategic standpoint. I mean, the timing, the coordination, the way you turned our own research against us. It's like you were running a counterintelligence operation. Counterintelligence? It was probably the most accurate description anyone had offered of the afternoon's events. They'd been gathering intelligence about my vulnerabilities and planning an operation to exploit them. I'd been gathering intelligence about their plans and preparing countermeasures. David, military training teaches you to think several moves ahead, to anticipate your opponent's strategy, and to prepare contingencies for multiple scenarios. Today wasn't personal. It was tactical. Patricia was shaking her head slowly, her diplomatic composure finally showing cracks after hours of trying to mediate an unmediated situation. Becky, this is your family, not your opponent. We're not enemy combatants trying to destroy your life. We're people who love you and want what's best for you, even if we've gone about it the wrong way. Enemy combatants. Love. What's best for you. The language of family relationships had become so tangled with the language of control and manipulation that it was difficult to separate genuine concern from strategic positioning. Patricia, enemy combatants are honest about their intentions. They don't pretend to be concerned about your welfare while they're planning to eliminate your autonomy. In some ways, that makes them easier to deal with than family members who use love as a weapon and concern as camouflage for their own agenda. The grandfather clock chimed again, marking another quarter hour in what had become the longest family meeting in recent memory. Soon it would be dark, and they'd all have to drive home to whatever living situations they'd been trying to upgrade through careful management of my real estate assets. Sarah was crying now, quiet tears that she probably thought made her look vulnerable and sympathetic rather than manipulative and defeated. Her psychology training had taught her about the power of emotional appeals, but apparently it hadn't prepared her for dealing with someone who'd learned to separate tactical considerations from emotional responses. Mom, I know you think we've been scheming against you, but that's not how it felt from our side. It felt like we were trying to solve a problem before it became a crisis. It felt like we were being responsible adult children who were thinking ahead about potential issues. I never wanted to hurt you or control you or take away your independence. Never wanted. As if intentions mattered more than actions. As if the impact of their behavior could be erased by claims about their motivations. Military operations are judged by their results, not by the good intentions of the people who plan them. Sarah, the road to bad outcomes is paved with good intentions. You may not have wanted to hurt me, but you accessed my confidential medical information without permission. You may not have wanted to control me, but you brought legal documents designed to strip away my decision-making authority. You may not have wanted to take away my independence, but you coordinated with multiple family members to pressure me into making decisions that would benefit you more than me. Michael had been quiet during Sarah's emotional appeal, but now he looked up with something that might have been genuine curiosity mixed with professional interest. Mom, can I ask about the estate planning changes you mentioned? I mean, I understand that you're angry about how we handled this situation, but are you really going to restructure your will based on one afternoon's conversation? One afternoon's conversation. As if months of coordination and manipulation could be reduced to a single disagreement that might be resolved with better communication and mutual understanding. Michael, the estate planning changes aren't based on one afternoon's conversation. They're based on months of observation about how you and your sister view your relationship to my assets. People who treat my independence as an obstacle to their inheritance don't get to benefit from that inheritance. It's a simple cause and effect relationship. The room fell quiet again as the implications of that statement settled in. They'd been so focused on managing my decisions to protect their future financial interests that they'd never considered the possibility that their management attempts might jeopardize those same interests. Patricia made one final attempt at family diplomacy, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who'd spent decades smoothing over conflicts and finding compromises in impossible situations. "Becky, families make mistakes. Families have misunderstandings. Families say and do things they regret when they're worried about each other. But families also forgive each other and find ways to move forward. This doesn't have to be the end of your relationship with Sarah and Michael. It could be a new beginning, a chance to establish better communication and clearer boundaries." New beginning. Better communication. Clearer boundaries. The language of therapeutic resolution, as if the afternoon's revelations could be processed and filed away as a learning experience, rather than acknowledged as a fundamental breach of trust that had been months in the making. Patricia, some boundaries can't be reestablished once they've been crossed. Some trust can't be rebuilt once it's been violated. Some relationships can't be repaired once the underlying power dynamics have been exposed. Today wasn't about miscommunication. It was about control, manipulation, and exploitation disguised as family concern. Sarah looked up from her manila folder, her tears reflecting the fading afternoon light that filtered through the windows of the house she'd been planning to force me to sell. "So that's it? You're really going to cut us out of your life? You're going to move into that penthouse and pretend you don't have children? Pretend you don't have children." As if acknowledging that I'd raised adults who were capable of managing their own lives somehow constituted parental abandonment. "Sarah, I'm not cutting you out of my life. I'm establishing the terms under which you can be part of my life. Those terms include respecting my autonomy, honoring my privacy, and treating me like an adult rather than like a problem to be managed. If you can accept those terms, we can rebuild our relationship. If you can't, then we'll discover that some relationships aren't worth rebuilding." The silence that followed was different from the previous silences in the room. This wasn't tactical positioning or shocked processing or desperate calculation. This was the silence of people finally understanding that the conversation was actually over, that the intervention had failed completely, and that the power dynamics in our family had shifted permanently. Michael closed his laptop bag with finality and stood up slowly, his business school confidence replaced by something that looked suspiciously like genuine respect, mixed with bewildered defeat. "Mom, I think we're going to need some time to process what happened here today. And I think you probably need some space to settle into your new life without feeling like we're hovering over every decision you make. Space. Time to process. New life." The language of someone finally beginning to understand that their carefully coordinated campaign had not only failed, but had fundamentally altered the relationship they'd been trying to preserve through control and manipulation. "Michael, that's probably the wisest thing anyone has said in this room all afternoon." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of packing boxes, forwarding addresses, and the peculiar satisfaction that comes from dismantling a life you're ready to leave behind. Each morning, I woke before dawn out of old habit, made my coffee black and strong, and spent the quiet hours before sunrise sorting through 15 years of accumulated possessions with the methodical precision of someone conducting inventory on a military supply depot. The house felt different now that I knew I was leaving. Rooms that had once felt like home began to feel like way stations, temporary accommodations that I'd occupied while planning my next move. The kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals became just a room with appliances. The living room where I'd hosted family dinners and holiday gatherings became just a space with furniture that would soon belong to someone else. Mrs. Chen from next door was the first neighbor to notice the moving boxes appearing on my front porch. She knocked on my door 3 days after the intervention, carrying a plate of her famous almond cookies and wearing the concerned expression of someone who'd seen too many neighbors disappear without explanation. "Rebecca, dear, are you really moving? The whole neighborhood is talking about the real estate signs and the boxes. Are you all right? Is everything okay with your health? I invited her in for coffee, grateful for a conversation that didn't involve financial projections or safety assessments or legal documents designed to strip away my autonomy. Mrs. Chen had been my neighbor for 7 years, and she'd never once suggested that my prosthetic leg made me unsuitable for suburban living. I'm fine, Mrs. Chen. Better than fine, actually. I'm moving downtown, to a penthouse apartment with a view of the city. It's time for a change. Her face lit up with genuine excitement, the kind of enthusiasm that comes from someone who's happy about your good fortune rather than calculating how it might benefit them. A penthouse! How wonderful! You must be so excited. And the views. Oh, I bet they're spectacular. Spectacular. It was refreshing to hear someone describe my housing decision in terms of positive possibilities, rather than medical necessities and safety concerns. Mrs. Chen saw a penthouse as an upgrade, an adventure, an opportunity. My family had seen it as a management solution for their disabled mother. Would you like to see some photos? The realtor sent me a virtual tour. We spent an hour looking at pictures of floor-to-ceiling windows, marble countertops, and panoramic views that stretched from Mount Hood to the Columbia River. Mrs. Chen oohed and awed over details that my family had presented as amenities I needed rather than luxuries I might enjoy. The kitchen is gorgeous, she said, studying the photos with the appreciation of someone who understood that cooking space mattered. And that bathroom, it's like a spa. You're going to love living there. Love living there. Not manage living there. Not survive living there. Not cope with living there. Love it. The distinction mattered more than I'd realized. Mrs. Chen, can I ask you something? Do you think I'm crazy for making such a big change at my age? For leaving this neighborhood, this house, everything familiar? She looked at me with the expression of someone who'd lived long enough to understand the difference between necessary risks and foolish ones. Rebecca, dear, crazy is staying somewhere that makes you feel small when you could be somewhere that makes you feel alive. You've earned the right to live exactly where you want to live. Earned the right. It was a phrase my family had never used during months of discussions about my housing situation. They'd talked about medical necessity and financial wisdom and safety requirements, but never about what I'd earned through decades of service and sacrifice. The moving company arrived on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after the intervention. Professional movers who treated my possessions with the care and efficiency of people who understood that every box represented someone's life being relocated rather than problems being solved. The crew chief was a veteran himself, Army infantry who'd served in Iraq during the surge. He noticed my military decorations while packing up my home office and asked about my service with the respectful curiosity of someone who understood what those ribbons represented. Afghanistan, ma'am. Which tours? I did 3 deployments to Iraq, but I heard Afghanistan was a different kind of challenge. We talked while his crew wrapped furniture and labeled boxes, trading stories about desert, heat and mountain cold, about the friends we'd left behind and the lessons we'd brought home. It was the kind of conversation I'd missed during months of family discussions about my limitations and medical needs. You know, ma'am, I've moved a lot of military families over the years. Active duty, retirees, widows who can't maintain the big houses anymore. But I have to say, moving to a downtown penthouse, that's a first. Most folks your age are downsizing to something smaller and quieter. Smaller and quieter. The default assumption that aging meant accepting less, wanting less, being satisfied with less. Even from someone who respected my service, the expectation was that I'd choose comfort over adventure. I've done smaller and quieter, I told him while we watched his crew load my dining room table into the truck. 22 years of government housing teaches you to appreciate space and views when you finally have the chance to choose them for yourself. He laughed, the knowing chuckle of someone who'd lived in enough temporary quarters to understand the appeal of permanence and luxury. Yes, ma'am. I bet that penthouse is going to feel like a palace after some of those forward operating bases. Palace. Another word my family had never used when describing the penthouse they'd wanted me to. They'd talked about accessibility features and security systems and medical support, but never about the simple pleasure of living somewhere beautiful because you wanted to, rather than because you had to. The last item to leave the house was my Purple Heart, packed carefully in a small box that I carried myself rather than trusting to the movers. As I locked the front door for the final time, I felt the same mix of anticipation and uncertainty that had accompanied every military move, every new assignment, every transition from one life to another. The penthouse was everything the photos had promised and more. 42 floors above the city, with views that stretched in every direction and light that poured through floor-to-ceiling windows like liquid gold. The kitchen was a chef's dream. The bathroom was indeed like a spa, and the master bedroom had a view of Mount Hood that made me catch my breath every morning. But the best part wasn't the luxury or the amenities or even the spectacular views. The best part was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of judgment. No one questioning my decisions, no one evaluating my capabilities, no one treating my independence like a problem to be solved. The building's concierge, Marcus, was a retired Marine who understood military courtesy and the importance of treating residents with respect rather than condescension. He helped me navigate the building's systems and introduced me to neighbors without once mentioning my prosthetic leg or asking about my medical needs. "Mrs. Martinez, if you need anything at all, just let me know. We've got great restaurants that deliver, grocery services if you don't want to shop yourself, and the building gym has some excellent adaptive equipment if you're interested in staying active." Staying active. Not managing my limitations or accommodating my disabilities, but staying active. The language mattered, and Marcus understood that treating people with dignity meant focusing on their capabilities rather than their constraints. My first week in the penthouse passed in a haze of unpacking, organizing, and discovering the rhythms of downtown living. The sounds were different. Traffic instead of lawnmowers, sirens instead of suburban quiet. But they felt like the sounds of possibility rather than problems. I established routines that pleased me rather than accommodating other people's schedules and expectations. Coffee at sunrise while watching the city wake up 42 floors below. Lunch on the balcony with views that changed throughout the day as light and shadow shifted across the urban landscape. Evening meals prepared in a kitchen that felt like a luxury rather than a necessity. The building's amenities were better than any military facility I'd ever experienced. The gym had equipment designed for people with various physical capabilities, operated by staff who understood fitness rather than limitations. The rooftop garden provided space for growing herbs and vegetables, something I'd missed from my suburban yard. The library had quiet corners perfect for reading without interruption or evaluation. But perhaps most importantly, the other residents treated me like a neighbor rather than a patient. The retired professor from the 38th floor, who shared gardening tips. The young couple from the 40th floor who invited me to join their weekend hiking group. The elderly widower from the 39th floor who appreciated having someone to discuss military history with over coffee in the building's cafe. These were people who saw a woman who'd chosen to live in a luxury building rather than a disabled veteran who'd been forced to downsize for safety reasons. The difference in perspective changed everything about how I moved through my days and thought about my future. On my 8th day in the penthouse, Sarah called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out over caution. Her voice was subdued, careful, stripped of the psychological authority she'd wielded during the intervention. "Mom, I've been thinking about what happened, about what you said, about what we did. I think I'm starting to understand how wrong we were." Starting to understand. The language of someone beginning to process information that challenged their fundamental assumptions about relationships and power and family dynamics. "Sarah, Understanding is a good place to start. I talked to my therapist about the whole situation. She helped me see that we were treating you like you were incompetent, when you were actually more competent than any of us. We were so focused on protecting you from imaginary dangers that we created real dangers to your autonomy and dignity. Therapist, competent, autonomy, and dignity. The language of someone who'd been forced to examine their own behavior through a professional lens rather than through the distorted mirror of family assumptions. What else did your therapist help you understand? There was a long pause before she answered, and I could hear the difficulty of admitting mistakes that went deeper than communication problems or tactical errors. She helped me understand that I was treating your disability like it defined your capabilities instead of recognizing it as one aspect of your experience. She helped me see that my psychology training made me think I knew what was best for you better than you did. And she helped me realize that some of my concern was really anxiety about my own future financial security. Anxiety about financial security. The honest acknowledgement of motivations that had been camouflaged as family concern and medical necessity during months of manipulation and coordination. Sarah, that kind of self-awareness is difficult to achieve. I'm proud of you for doing the work to get there. Mom, I know I don't have the right to ask for forgiveness. I know we violated your trust and your privacy and your dignity in ways that can't be easily repaired. But I'm wondering if there might be a way for us to start over, to build a different kind of relationship based on respect instead of control. Start over. Different kind of relationship. Respect instead of control. The language of someone who'd finally understood the fundamental problem with their approach to family relationships. Sarah, starting over is possible, but it requires more than understanding what went wrong. It requires demonstrating that you've learned from what went wrong. What would that look like? How do I demonstrate that I've learned? It was, I realized, the first question she'd asked in months that focused on my preferences rather than her assumptions about what I needed or wanted. It looks like asking instead of assuming. It looks like supporting my decisions instead of trying to manage them. It looks like treating me like an adult with the right to make my own choices, even when those choices involve some risk or seem irrational to you. And Michael? What about Michael and the financial planning and the real estate stuff? Michael. My son who'd calculated my net worth and projected my future expenses and treated my assets like components in a portfolio that needed professional management. Michael needs to do his own work to understand the difference between financial advice and financial control. He needs to learn that my money belongs to me, not to his projections about what I should do with it. Mom, can I ask about the penthouse? Are you happy there? Is it what you wanted, or did you buy it just to make a point about your independence? Happy. There. It was the same question David had asked, but coming from Sarah, it carried different weight. This was my daughter trying to understand whether I'd made decisions based on my actual preferences or purely as a tactical response to their manipulation. Sarah, I'm happier here than I've been in years. Not because the penthouse is perfect, but because I chose it for my own reasons instead of having it chosen for me by other people's assumptions about what I needed. The views must be incredible. They are. But the best part isn't the views. The best part is waking up every morning in a place I chose because I wanted to be there, not because someone else decided it was appropriate for my age and medical condition. Another long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something that sounded like genuine curiosity rather than therapeutic assessment. Mom, would you be willing to let me visit sometime? Not to evaluate your living situation or offer advice about anything, but just to see your new home and maybe have dinner together. Visit. See your new home. Have dinner together. The language of normal family relationships rather than medical interventions or safety assessments. Sarah, I'd like that. But I need you to understand that visiting means respecting my space and my choices. It means asking before offering advice. It means treating me like a hostess rather than a patient. I understand. And Mom? I'm sorry. Really, genuinely sorry for everything we put you through. You deserved better from your family. Deserved better. The acknowledgement I'd been waiting months to hear, the recognition that their concern had crossed lines that shouldn't have been crossed. Sarah, apologies are important. But what matters more is whether you've learned enough to make sure it doesn't happen again. I think I have. I hope I have. Hope. It was more honest than certainty, more realistic than promises, and it suggested that she understood the magnitude of the trust that would need to be rebuilt. As I hung up the phone and returned to my view of the city spreading out below my windows, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The possibility that my family relationships might evolve into something based on mutual respect rather than assumed authority. But whether that happened or not, I had what I'd been fighting for all along, the right to live my own life according to my own values, in a place I'd chosen for my own reasons, with the dignity that comes from being treated like an adult rather than a problem to be solved. The penthouse wasn't just a luxury apartment. It was proof that sometimes the best defense against people who want to manage your life is to take control of it yourself, completely and irrevocably, before they realize what you're capable of achieving on your own terms. 2 weeks after Sarah's phone call, Michael finally made contact. Not through a call or text, but through an email that arrived at 2:47 a.m., the timestamp suggesting he'd been wrestling with whatever he wanted to say for hours before finally sending it. The subject line read simply, "Financial analysis, personal, not professional." I read it over my morning coffee while watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and amber 42 floors below. The email was different from anything Michael had ever written to me. No spreadsheets attached, no investment projections, no calculations about optimal resource allocation. Instead, it was 3 pages of what appeared to be genuine self-reflection, mixed with the kind of analytical thinking that had gotten him into trouble in the first place. "Mom," it began, "I've been trying to figure out how to approach you after what happened, and I keep coming back to numbers because that's how my brain works. But this time, I want to analyze what I did wrong instead of what you should do differently." He'd attempted to quantify his mistakes. "I accessed your private, medical information without authorization. I coordinated with multiple family members to pressure you into financial decisions without your input. I treated your assets like they were part of a portfolio I was managing instead of recognizing them as your personal resources to use as you saw fit." The clinical language was vintage Michael, but the content suggested he'd been forced to examine his own behavior with the same analytical rigor he'd once applied to my financial situation. It was progress, though I wondered whether he truly understood the emotional impact of his actions or was simply cataloging errors in judgment like debugging code. "I keep trying to calculate the probability that you'll ever trust me again," the email continued, "but I realize that's the wrong question. The right question is whether I've learned enough to deserve that trust if you're willing to offer it." The distinction mattered. Michael was finally asking the right question, even if his approach to answering it remained fundamentally analytical. But analysis could be a bridge to understanding if it was applied to the right problems. "I want to request a meeting," he concluded. "Not to present solutions or offer advice or try to repair anything. Just to see your new home and understand what your life looks like now that you're living it on your own terms. Living it on your own terms." The phrase suggested he'd begun to understand that autonomy was the central issue, not safety or finances, or family coordination. It was encouraging, though I'd learned to be cautious about encouraging signs from family members who'd spent months surprising me with their capacity for manipulation. I forwarded the email to Dr. Patricia Henley, the therapist I'd started seeing after moving to the penthouse, not because I was struggling with the transition, but because I wanted professional guidance on rebuilding family relationships that had been damaged by months of coordinated manipulation. Dr. Henley specialized in family dynamics and had particular expertise in situations where adult children attempted to control aging parents through concern disguised as authority. "Rebecca," she said during our session that afternoon. "This email suggests your son is beginning to understand the difference between being helpful and being controlling. But understanding and changing behavior are two different things. How do you feel about the possibility of seeing him?" How did I feel? The question was more complicated than it appeared. Military training teaches you to separate tactical considerations from emotional responses, but family relationships exist in the space where tactics and emotions intersect in complex ways. "I feel cautious," I admitted. "Michael's approach has always been to analyze problems and propose solutions. Even when he's analyzing his own mistakes, he's still trying to manage the situation through careful planning and strategic communication." Dr. Henley nodded, making notes in the way that therapists do when they're tracking patterns, rather than just recording information. "What would it look like for him to approach you differently? What would convince you that he's genuinely changed? His perspective rather than just refined his approach?" The question forced me to articulate something I'd been feeling, but hadn't quite formulated. The difference between apologizing for tactics and understanding the fundamental problem with the mindset that had generated those tactics. He'd need to demonstrate that he sees me as an autonomous adult, rather than as a problem that requires his expertise to solve. He'd need to show that he can interact with me without trying to optimize my decisions or improve my situation. And how would you know if he's capable of that kind of interaction? I thought about Mrs. Chen's enthusiasm for my penthouse views, about Marcus the concierge's respectful professionalism, about the retired professor who shared gardening tips without evaluating my horticultural competence. He'd ask about my experience instead of assessing my choices. He'd express curiosity about my life instead of concern about my decisions. He'd treat my independence as an accomplishment rather than a risk factor to be managed. Dr. Henley smiled, the expression of someone who'd watched many families navigate similar transitions. "Those are reasonable criteria, and they're specific enough that you'll be able to evaluate whether he's meeting them." I decided to invite Michael for dinner the following Sunday, but with conditions that I outlined in my response email. He could visit for 2 hours. He could not bring financial documents, research materials, or suggestions about any aspect of my living situation. He could ask questions about my experience, but could not offer advice about my choices. If he violated any of these boundaries, the visit would end immediately. His response arrived within an hour. "Understood and accepted. Thank you for the opportunity." Sunday afternoon arrived gray and drizzly, typical November weather that made the penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows feel like a barrier between the warmth inside and the bleakness outside. I'd prepared a simple meal: roasted chicken, vegetables, from the building's rooftop garden, bread from the artisanal bakery down the street. Nothing elaborate, but everything chosen because I enjoyed it rather than because it met someone else's nutritional recommendations or dietary restrictions. Michael arrived exactly on time, carrying a single bottle of wine and wearing the careful expression of someone approaching a situation where the normal rules didn't apply. He looked around the penthouse with what appeared to be genuine appreciation rather than professional assessment, though I could see him consciously restraining whatever analytical instincts wanted to evaluate the space. "Mom, this is... wow. The views are incredible, and the light, I can see why you love it here. Love it here. Not find it suitable or appreciate the amenities, but love it." The language suggested he was trying to understand my experience rather than evaluate my choices. "Thank you. Would you like to see the rest of the apartment?" We walked through the space slowly, Michael asking questions about my routines and preferences, rather than offering observations about efficiency or functionality. He admired the kitchen's design without suggesting improvements. He appreciated the bedroom's view without commenting on accessibility features. He examined my home office setup with curiosity rather than professional critique. "You've got a great workspace here," he said, looking at the desk where I'd been writing letters to other veterans and organizing my volunteer schedule. "Are you working on anything interesting?" "Working on anything interesting. The question of someone making conversation rather than gathering information for analysis and optimization. I'm helping other veterans navigate the disability benefits system. Turns out that experience with military bureaucracy and a talent for reading complex regulations are useful skills for people who need help understanding what they're entitled to. Michael's face lit up with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than professional curiosity. That sounds really meaningful. Are you working with an organization, or is this something you're doing independently? Both. I volunteer with the VA hospital, but I also get referrals from other veterans who need help with paperwork or appeals. It's satisfying work, using my skills to help people who are dealing with the same systems I've navigated. That's amazing, Mom. I had no idea you were doing that kind of work. No idea. Because he'd been so focused on managing my physical limitations and financial decisions that he'd never asked about my interests, my goals, my sense of purpose beyond the safety concerns that had dominated our conversations for months. We sat down for dinner as the afternoon light faded and the city lights began to twinkle 42 floors below. Michael poured wine and served food without offering to help with tasks I could clearly manage myself. The conversation flowed more naturally than it had in months, ranging from his work challenges to my building's community events, to current events that had nothing to do with my medical condition or housing situation. Michael, I said over dessert, and coffee. This is the first time in months that we've had a conversation where you haven't tried to solve any problems or optimize any decisions. How does it feel? He considered the question carefully, swirling wine in his glass while he formulated his response. Honestly, it feels foreign. My instinct is still to look for ways to help, to identify areas where my expertise might be useful. But I'm starting to understand that treating you like a project to be managed was insulting and wrong. Insulting and wrong. Stronger language than I'd expected from someone who usually spoke in terms of efficiency and optimization. What helped? You understand that? Partly, it was seeing how completely you outmaneuvered all of us. The strategic thinking, the timing, the way you turned our own research against us. It made me realize that someone capable of that level of planning and execution didn't need my help managing basic life decisions. Outmaneuvered. It was military language, and it suggested he'd begun to understand our family conflict in strategic rather than therapeutic terms. But mostly, he continued, it was realizing that I'd been treating you like you were my responsibility. Instead of recognizing that you're an autonomous adult who's perfectly capable of being responsible for yourself. Autonomous adult. Responsible for yourself. The language I'd been waiting months to hear from someone who'd spent so much time calculating what I should do instead of asking what I wanted to do. And how do you feel about not being responsible? For managing my decisions? He laughed, a sound with more relief than humor. Terrifying and liberating at the same time. Terrifying because I can't control outcomes that matter to me. Liberating because I don't have to solve problems that aren't actually mine to solve. The distinction was crucial. Michael was beginning to understand the difference between caring about someone and taking responsibility for someone, between wanting good outcomes and trying to control the decisions that led to those outcomes. Michael, can I ask you something that might be uncomfortable? Of course. During all those months when you were researching my housing options and analyzing my financial situation, how much of your motivation was about my well-being and how much was about protecting your own future financial interests? The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a distant fire. Michael set down his coffee cup and stared out at the city lights for several long moments before answering. I've been asking myself the same question. The honest answer is that I convinced myself it was all about your well-being, but in retrospect, I think my financial security was a bigger factor than I wanted to admit. Honest answer. Bigger factor than I wanted to admit. The kind of self-awareness that suggested genuine reflection rather than strategic positioning. I kept thinking about Sarah and David struggling to afford rent, about Jennifer and me living in her parents' basement, about how a downtown penthouse would eventually provide the kind of asset base that could change our family's financial trajectory. I told myself I was thinking about your best interests, but I was also calculating inheritance implications. Inheritance implications. The phrase he'd used during the intervention, now acknowledged as a primary motivation rather than a secondary consideration. I'm ashamed of that, Mom. I'm ashamed that I treated your independence as an obstacle to my financial planning instead of respecting it as something you'd earned through decades of service and sacrifice. Earned through service and sacrifice. The recognition that my autonomy wasn't a privilege to be managed, but a right to be respected. Michael, acknowledging those motivations is difficult. It requires the kind of honesty that most people avoid because it's uncomfortable to examine our own selfishness. Are you disappointed in me? In who I became during all of this? Disappointed? The question suggested he was asking for evaluation rather than validation, which was progress from someone who'd spent months trying to manage outcomes through careful presentation of information. I'm disappointed in the choices you made, but I'm encouraged by your willingness to examine those choices honestly and to change your approach based on what you've learned. What would it take for you to trust me again? I mean, really trust. Me, not just tolerate my presence because we're family. Trust me again. The acknowledgement that trust had been damaged and needed to be rebuilt rather than simply restored through apology and good intentions. Trust gets rebuilt through consistent behavior over time, Michael. It's not something that can be negotiated or calculated. It's something that gets demonstrated day by day. Decision by decision, conversation by conversation. And what does that look like practically? What kinds of behavior would demonstrate that I've actually changed my approach? It was, I realized, a perfectly reasonable question from someone whose analytical mind needed concrete criteria for evaluating progress. But it was also a question that revealed he still thought in terms of optimizing outcomes rather than simply behaving with integrity. It looks like asking about my experience instead of assessing my choices. It looks like expressing interest in my life without trying to improve it. It looks like treating my decisions as information about my preferences rather than problems that need your input. Michael nodded slowly, apparently processing these criteria through whatever mental framework he used to understand behavioral change. And it looks like being genuinely curious about who I am now instead of trying to manage who you think I should become. Who you are now, he repeated thoughtfully. I realize I've been so focused on your limitations and risks that I never asked about your goals or interests or what you want your life to look like going forward. Never asked. Because he'd been too busy calculating what I should want based on his assumptions about age and disability and optimal resource allocation. As Michael prepared to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at the penthouse with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mom, can I say something that might sound strange? Of course. I'm proud of you, not in a condescending way, but genuinely proud. What you did, outthinking all of us, buying this place, establishing boundaries that we had to respect, it was brilliant. I spent months underestimating you, and you reminded me that the woman who raised me is much more formidable than I'd given her credit for. Formidable. It was military language, the kind of word used to describe worthy opponents rather than family members who needed protection and management. Thank you, Michael. That means more to me than you probably realize. And, Mom, I'm sorry. Really, genuinely sorry for treating you like you were my project to manage instead of my mother to respect. Project to manage. Mother to respect. The distinction that had been at the heart of months of family conflict, finally articulated by someone who'd been on the wrong side of it. As the door closed behind him, and I was alone again with my spectacular views and my hard-won independence, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope that my family relationships might evolve into something based on mutual respect rather than assumed authority.